Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. Let's talk a little bit about HD remakes. I think that's something that is reasonably pertinent at the moment. Why? Well, I got this thing right here. God, it's a series that I love. It's Heroes of Might and Magic. Absolutely wonderful series. I've liked almost every game in it. I think only number 4 really disappointed me. And that was mostly because they messed with the formula perhaps a little bit too much in ways that didn't really work out. But for a lot of people, Heroes of Might and Magic 3 is considered to be the classic. Like, that's the benchmark that the series is judged by. And the reason for that, more so than anything, is that Heroes 3 is the pinnacle of the evolution of the original Heroes games, with the original studio behind them, before things went a little bit off the rails. Heroes 4 was developed by New World Computing, the same company that did all of the previous Heroes games, but it sported some fairly major mechanical changes, including the idea that heroes could fight and die, and changing the way that the battle scenes worked so that it switched over to a hex-based style. And frankly, a lot of people didn't really dig that. And then, of course, with Heroes 5, we had Nevil Interactive taking over the duties of New World Computing. That had its moments, especially with the expansion. I think that Heroes 5 wasn't too bad, although it suffered from technical problems. And then we had Black Hole Entertainment that got Heroes 6, which suffered from online issues, let's just put it that way. Ubisoft's obsession with always online followed Heroes of Might and Magic into number 6 for no real apparent reason, and there was no major benefit to having any of this online access whatsoever. Not to mention the fact that they removed some of the resources from the game and arguably dumbed it down a bit. So for many people, Heroes of Might and Magic has been on the decline. So when you see Heroes of Might and Magic 3 HD Remastered Edition pop right up, you're gonna think to yourself, well, maybe that's a good idea. Maybe that's something worth playing. I mean, it was the best of the series, right? So what's the harm in doing an HD edition of that? Well, there's not necessarily a harm in it, but there's not necessarily a benefit to it either. Heroes 3 HD Edition is one of the laziest HD ports that I've ever seen. Ask me what benefits the remaster has, and I can talk about that in about 30 seconds flat. It's not really that difficult. They redrew the sprites. They allowed you to play the game in 16:9 resolutions. And that would be it. Yup, that is it. That is all they did. And more to the point, what's actually notable about the HD edition is what's missing from it. Both of the expansion packs, both Armageddon's Blade and Shadow of Death, are nowhere to be seen. And why? Because apparently the source code has been lost, and Ubisoft can't do it. So the HD edition is missing 13 campaigns. 13. There were 6 in Armageddon's Blade, and 7 in Shadow of Death. It's also missing an entire faction in the form of the Conflux, not to mention a large number of new neutral creatures and artifacts to be discovered, and of course the random map generator, which is nowhere to be seen in the HD edition. But hey, they did add a Steam multiplayer lobby, so I suppose that's okay if you wish to continue to play the game in multiplayer, which frankly I've never really seen the appeal of. The waiting times are far too ridiculous to really justify it, and efforts in the later games to add something that you could do during the other player's turns really didn't work out all that well. It would also appear that there's been a mandatory delay put on every turn click in the multiplayer, which is not exactly great. Toss on there as the grand cherry on top the fact that the game does not support the rather extensive content mods in the Wake of the Gods and Horn of the Abyss, and you have what appears to be a pretty damn bad deal. And it really is. If you compare it on Steam to the price on GOG, who are, full disclosure, our sponsors for Axiom Esports, you can get the Heroes of Might and Magic 3 Complete Edition for $10, which contains both the original game and both the expansions, or pay $15 for the HD remaster on Steam, which is lacking a great deal of that content. They haven't even managed to get the damn thing running at 60 frames per second. It's locked at 33 for no real apparent reason. But I suppose it's okay, because hey, you can play it in a 16:9 resolution. Except you could do that already if you downloaded the HD mod, which unfortunately does not remake the sprites. It just really makes things smaller, but if you wish to play in a larger window, you can do that with the HD mod. So what on earth is the point of this thing? Well, it seems like, for the most part, the reason that they even released this was so they could get it onto iPad for $10, which I have to admit is a reasonable idea. Would I play this on iPad? Absolutely. I mean, that's an example of a great game that's absolutely appropriate for a touch device on a platform that is perhaps lacking in really great games. So I don't really see the problem in that, but bringing it to PC as well seems ultimately pointless. And one has to ask the question exactly, what is the purpose of an HD remake, especially on PC? When should you make one? And at what point does the HD remake become completely redundant? Well, I think in the case of Heroes of Might and Magic 3, it is redundant, because not only do we already have a functioning version available DRM-free on GOG, but it has far more content than this one does. And I don't think there should ever be a situation where you release your HD remaster and it somehow has less content than the original version did to begin with. Now, there are certain situations where it would be okay and logical to do some kind of HD re-release, particularly in the case of a game that just doesn't run properly on modern OSs anymore or isn't otherwise available. And for that, we have an example like, say, Grim Fandango. This is a game that is not, or at least wasn't, available on digital distribution in any way. You couldn't buy it, and it didn't run properly on a lot of modern OSs. It didn't even install on 64-bit machines. There were ways and means around it by using spin-offs of the Scum VM project, like Residual VM, for instance. There's an unofficial launcher that might work. But let's be frank, the damn thing is a complete and total mess at this point, which is why when you come out with an HD remaster of that, suddenly people are a little bit more willing to accept it, and rightfully so, because you've just given them a way to play it again. In the case of Heroes, you already had a way to play it. And even if Grim Fandango doesn't do everything that I personally would have wanted it to from an HD remaster, for instance, it still runs in 4:3 resolution because of the way that the levels were designed, and that's really unfortunate on modern OSs, it runs, which is more than I can say for what it did previously, and I can buy it, which is also more than what I could have done previously. I'd rather not buy an old disc-based version and have it probably not work, and then give money to people that really were not actually responsible for making the game in the first place. You know, I want the money to go to the people that made the game, and one would hope that Grim Fandango HD Remaster allows me to do that, and also allows me to play it on a modern OS, admittedly with some problems here and there. So there's a situation where you've got a game that is not available, and even if it were available, is probably not going to work properly on a modern OS, now being available again thanks to an HD remaster. I mean, that's something to be happy about, right? That's something to celebrate. Of course, there are other forthcoming remasters that fulfill this particular requirement. Something like Homeworld Remastered, for instance. Not only are they making that game look a hell of a lot better, like a significant visual improvement over the original, but again, you couldn't actually get that game unless you picked it up on disc. Not available on any kind of digital platform whatsoever. I think in some situations you can actually make the case that HD remasters are not so much required, but beneficial for the preservation of our gaming culture. And I know that sounds rather pretentious, but we're talking about the idea that games cease to function on modern operating systems, source code is lost, preservation becomes a problem, and as a direct result, we lose access to parts of our gaming history which are very relevant today. Homeworld is still a very relevant game. Heroes of Might and Magic is still a very relevant game. The difference between the two is that one was already available and working just fine, and actually did preserve the two expansions, and the other was essentially lost in the pit of time and perhaps would have never seen the light of day again. Indeed, Homeworld Cataclysm, which is not part of the main Homeworld storyline, is unfortunately still AWOL. We have no real way of acquiring that without access to either used copies or piracy. Another great example of an HD remake that actually makes sense would be the remastered edition of the original Resident Evil, which is actually a remaster of a remaster. The original remaster came out on the GameCube, so PC gamers didn't have access to that, and then they remastered that again, brought it out on PC and other platforms, and as it turns out, it's actually a really nice piece of preservation. In that case, you can argue that the upgrades are so significant over the original that they actually make the game more enjoyable to play, whereas I really don't think that something like Heroes 3 HD actually qualifies. That, I think, is the difference between what is essentially a cash-in in the form of Heroes 3 and something that has genuine value. There are situations on console, of course, where a remaster might be useful. Last of Us is a prime example of that, probably one of the best examples of remasters, simply because it improves the playability of the game. It's not just a graphical improvement, as much as people might like to wax lyrical on that subject. It's a playability improvement. It's an improvement in frame rate. It's a game that was dropping below 30, now running at 60. That's more playable. It's that simple. It's easier to control. It's more enjoyable to play. It's a great upgrade. And more to the point, it's a cross-generational thing. There is no backwards compatibility between the PlayStation 4 and 3, so remasters in that respect do make a great degree of sense. And while it may not seem so obvious on PC, there are certainly times when there are games that I genuinely wish had been remastered because they just don't work anymore, they're just not available anymore, or they were so old that it's got to the point where you just don't want to play them. One area that I feel is very overlooked when it comes to HD remasters is the idea of the interface, actually changing that up. More often than not, I find, especially when I go back to old DOS strategy games, that I run into this position where the interface is just so damn archaic and a lot of the modern advancements that we've made in UI design are simply not present, and as a result, I just don't want to play it anymore. This is also very much true when you're dealing with a game that doesn't have a tutorial and relied upon a manual, and of course you don't possess the manual, ergo you can't remember the first damn thing about how to play it. I ran into that position with X-Wing Alliance quite recently. The game's tutorial is surprisingly lackluster, and it's the sort of thing that you would never have happen in modern games. The idea that it doesn't tell you some of the most basic things, it doesn't even mention how to shift power to weapons and shields and so on and so forth, which is necessary to even be able to fire for more than a couple of seconds. You will die constantly if you don't know how to do that. Unfortunately, in many cases, what we're seeing is that HD remasters are not adding new content, and you do need that for a tutorial. You may need a tutorial level, or simply to modify existing content within the game to add a tutorial in. And many of these remasters aren't doing anything of the sort, which I feel is something of a missed opportunity to say the least in many cases. I think the main problem that I have with remasters comes down to this. More often than not, they seem to be created for no real reason. They don't have a grand purpose behind them. It's not like things were thought out to a great degree and they said to themselves, well, what would be relevant about this? Can we make this relevant again in 2015? Is this the sort of thing that really could use a little bit of spit and polish, or are we simply doing it for money? Because that's exactly how I feel about Heroes 3 Remaster. It doesn't add to the experience, it subtracts from it. The graphics weren't really relevant in the first place, it was still very playable in 2015, it works on modern operating systems, so what was the need for this? It reminds me of the HD remake of Painkiller. While it was competent, why did it exist? I mean, there's nothing wrong with the current version of Painkiller. Painkiller Black Edition works just fine on modern operating systems. You don't need a new version of Painkiller, especially when you take content away from the original game, as Painkiller Hell and Damnation absolutely did. So when it all comes down to it, I think there's around 6 valid reasons to create a remaster that puts it beyond simply being a cash grab. The first one of those is that the game is not available on digital distribution in any form, which justifies remaking it in some way and re-releasing it. Secondly, it's not compatible with modern operating systems or consoles. That's, again, a good reason. You want to be able to play the game, but you can't, so someone needs to do some work on it in order to make it operate properly again. Thirdly, the graphics are so archaic as to need a reboot, and even that's questionable at best, because a lot of that really is in the eye of the beholder. I can still play TIE Fighter, even though graphically it is archaic. It's a very simple, polygon-based game, but it still looks fine, it's functional, it still plays fine, it doesn't need a remaster. Fourthly, an effort to revive the multiplayer community. You can definitely see a lot of validity in things like Halo the Master Chief Collection when it comes to that. Those are classic titles, and many of them are not playable anymore because the servers were shut down. You can't play Halo 2 online anymore unless you get the Master Chief Collection. Number 5, the UI being so archaic as to need a reboot. As I mentioned earlier, I would absolutely love to see XCOM rebooted, remastered, but with the UI improved. And as it turns out, they did that. It's called Xenonauts, and you should probably have a look at it, because it keeps almost all of the original features of XCOM and redoes the interface in a way that actually makes sense and isn't horribly awful to use. And lastly, the game is an absolute classic that's in danger of being lost forever, which I suppose is something of a roll-up of the last 5 points or so, really. I think there are games like Ico, there are games like Shadow of the Colossus that deserved remasters simply because they were cult classics. They maybe didn't sell that well, and they weren't in production anymore. We don't get a great deal of HD remasters on the PC, because, frankly, they're often not that relevant. that you will see them on consoles a great deal because of the lack of backwards compatibility, but is it really so bad that we're getting some of these remasters on PC? I mean, more often than not, it seems like we're getting at least reasonable versions. You know, Resident Evil is good, Homeworld Remastered will hopefully be good, Grim Fandango Remastered is decent enough, although you have things like Heroes, and then you have things like Fahrenheit or Indigo Prophecy, which really serve no practical purpose. It certainly seems to be a way of making a quick dollar. That seems to be the focus behind a great deal of this. Though, you can make the argument, I suppose, that, especially with things like Heroes, a successful relaunch of Heroes 3 could generate additional revenue to fund Heroes 7. It could prove that there is continued interest in the genre. So you could argue that that is perhaps a positive. I think the embarrassing thing about Heroes 3 is the fact that by remastering Heroes 3, they're essentially admitting that Heroes 4, 5, and 6 are junk in comparison, because why would you bother to remaster if you already had perfectly functional Heroes games available? The reception of Heroes 6 in particular seems to have been something of a kick in the arse for them, and now they're saying, oh well, do you remember how good Heroes 3 was? Well, yes, I do, but I also remember it having expansion packs, and you seem to have forgotten those, so maybe that's something that you might want to consider in future. We'll be seeing a great deal more HD remasters and remakes coming over the next few years, that I have absolutely no doubt. And what I would say to people is that they just need to kind of try and keep their nostalgia in check. A great deal of people bought the Heroes of Might and Magic 3 HD remaster despite so many recommendations on the Steam review section telling you not to do it. At the time of recording this video, there's 3,000 people playing Heroes of Might and Magic 3 HD, which actually makes it one of the more popular games on Steam. It's in the top 100, and it's kind of a shame, I suppose, that this sort of lazy slapdash approach to remastering is being rewarded with money, and I hope that it drives a great deal of people to GOG to go and buy the proper version, or just pick it up on iPad, where it actually serves some sort of practical purpose. But let's be honest, of all the things that one could complain about, I honestly feel that perhaps HD remasters are fairly low on the totem pole when it comes to importance. They are relatively inoffensive uses of studios' time that perhaps could encourage further interest in the franchise, and if that is the evil required in order to make sure that a series that I enjoy like Heroes of Might and Magic continues and doesn't suck, well then so be it. I suppose it's a small enough price to pay, isn't it? Still, don't buy Heroes 3 HD. It's a waste of your money. Thank you very much for watching, folks, and I'll see you next time.